The alarm screamed 3 seconds before I saw it, a sharp rising tone that cut through the hum of the bridge and made every one of my crew freeze mid-motion. I had spent 31 years as a cartographer for the Arathi Collective, mapping dead nebulae and cataloging barren rock, and in all that time I had never heard our passive sensor array produce that particular sound. It was the detection signature for structured electromagnetic output, not solar noise, not radiation. Echo, something deliberate, something with a pattern, and it was coming from inside the dead zone. My name is Valeth Saranu. I was senior cartographer aboard the survey vessel ascending calm, and we were 3 weeks into what should have been the most boring assignment of my career. The Galactic conquered the alliance of 42 spacefaring species that had governed this region of the galaxy for over 600,000 years, wanted updated scans of the dead zone, bureaucratic routine, a box to check before the territory could be reclassified for future expansion. Nobody expected us to find anything. The dead zone had been silent for longer than most civilizations survived, and every scientist, historian, and politician in the Conquered had agreed on one simple fact: whatever had lived there was gone. The dead zone, every species in the Conquered knew the name, and every species avoided it, a vast stretch of space, roughly 4,000 light-years across, surrounding a small yellow star that ancient records called Sol. 500,000 years ago, a species had lived there. They called themselves humans. They had been fast and loud and restless, spreading across colony worlds at a rate that alarmed the elder civilizations of the Conquered. They built ships, established trade routes, argued with diplomats, and multiplied in ways that made the more measured species deeply uncomfortable. The Conquered's records described them as impulsive, creative, dangerously curious, and remarkably adaptable species that treated the void between stars not as a barrier but as a personal challenge. Then they went silent. It happened fast. Even by galactic standards, in less than a century, every human colony, every relay beacon, every communication buoy, and every trade station inside the Sol perimeter stopped transmitting. The region went dark, completely dark. The Conquered sent 3 separate probe fleets over the following millennia. Not one of them returned after the third disappearance. The Conquered sealed the boundary, classified the region as extinct territory, and moved on. The dominant theory was self-destruction, a civil conflict, perhaps, or a rogue artificial intelligence consuming everything in its path. Some scholars argued plague. A few fringe theorists suggested something stranger, that humanity had simply left. But left for where? The question had no answer, and over the centuries it stopped being asked. The consensus was simple and final: humanity was gone. Case closed. Update the maps, seal the border, forget. And now my sensor array was telling me otherwise. I stood over Dreeneth's shoulder, watching the data scroll across his display. Dreeneth was my communications officer, quiet and precise individual who had never once raised his voice in the years I had known him. But his hands were shaking. The signal he was analyzing was faint, buried deep in background noise, but unmistakable. Once you knew what to look for, it had rhythm, it had structure, it had mathematical consistency that could not be produced by any known natural phenomenon. This was not a dying star or A spinning pulsar, this was a broadcast. He ran it against every known language. And cipher format in the Concord. Database no match. But the underlying architecture of the signal, the way the data was organized at its most basic mathematical level, matched an archaic format preserved in old Concord archives, a format that had been used by one species and one species alone, the species that was supposed to be dead. That is a human communication protocol, Drenith said. His voice was barely above a whisper. The mathematical framework is identical. I have checked it 4 times. Behind me, Krelt, my security officer, stepped forward. He was large even by Urathi standards, broad across the shoulders and built for endurance rather than speed. He had spent 15 years in the Concord Defense Force before transferring to survey work, seeking what he called a quieter life. He was not a man who frightened easily, but I could see the tension in his posture, the way his weight shifted slightly toward the exit, as though his body was preparing for a decision his mind had not yet made. "We need to leave," he said. "Now this is not what we were sent to find, and not something a survey vessel should be investigating. The signal is originating from deep inside the perimeter," Drenith continued, as if Krelt had not spoken. "At least 200 light-years past the boundary. Consistent broadcast, no degradation. Whatever is producing it has been doing so for a very long time. That is precisely why we need to leave," Krelt repeated, and for the first time I heard genuine urgency in his voice, not fear exactly. Professional caution sharpened to a point. 3 probe fleets entered that region and never came back. We are not a military vessel, we are map makers. I stared at the display. The signal pulsed with a steady, patient rhythm. Not frantic, not aggressive. It reminded me of a heartbeat, regular, calm, and persistent. It had been broadcasting for who knew how long, waiting for someone to listen. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on my shoulders. 31 years of mapping empty rock, and the universe had finally placed something genuinely unknown in front of me. I made the worst decision of my career, or the best one. I have never been able to decide which. "Torvin," I said to my navigator, young man on his first deep space assignment, who looked at me with eyes that were equal parts excitement and terror, "set a course past the boundary. Take us in." The bridge went silent. Torvin looked at me as though I had asked him to fly us into a star. Krell opened his mouth to argue, and I watched the protest form on his lips and then die there, stopped by something in my expression that I could not have described if asked. I was not being reckless, I was being precise. I knew what extinction looked like on a sensor readout. I had cataloged the remains of 17 dead civilizations across my career. Every one of them left a specific pattern in the data, signature of absence, of systems winding down and energy dissipating and matter returning to chaos. This signal was the opposite of that pattern. This was not an echo, this was a voice. We crossed the boundary 12 minutes later. The moment we passed the old Concord marker beacons, I felt a shift in the atmosphere aboard the ship. Every member of my 16-person crew understood that we had just entered forbidden territory. 500,000 years of quarantine, and we had broken it with a survey vessel that carried no meaningful defenses. Our Strongest weapon was a geological laser, designed for sample collection, and it could barely scratch refined metal at close range. For the first 12 hours, nothing happened. The void around us was empty and still. No debris fields, no derelict stations, no sign that anything had ever existed in this region. I began to doubt myself. Perhaps the signal was an echo after all, a ghost bouncing off some forgotten relay that had somehow survived the millennia. Perhaps Krelt was right and I was leading my crew into nothing but empty space and a disciplinary hearing. Then our long-range sensors began to light up. It started as a flicker, a single energy signature at the edge of detection range, then 2, then 10, then 100. Within minutes, the entire forward sensor display was blazing with contacts, so many that the system could not resolve them individually, and began clustering them into groups. Every single contact was active, radiating heat and electromagnetic energy, and drive signatures that our computers could not classify. Torvin's fingers moved across his console with increasing speed, trying to make sense of what the data was telling him. He was the first to understand. He had pulled up the formation data and overlaid it onto our stellar charts, and his face had gone a color I had never seen on a Urathi before. "Cartographer," he said, and his voice cracked on the second syllable. "Those are ships." I leaned forward. "How many?" He swallowed hard enough that I could hear it from across the bridge. "Thousands." The number did not register at first. I think my brain simply refused to process it. Thousands of ships, active ships in a region that had been classified as empty for 500,000 years, arranged not in the random scatter of wreckage or the loose drift of abandoned vessels, but in organized geometric formations that spoke of discipline, purpose, and command. I gripped the edge of Dreenath's console and forced myself to breathe. Behind me, I could hear Krelt's slow, measured exhale, the sound of a man reassessing every assumption he had ever held. Ahead of us, through the viewport, the stars burned on in silence, but between those stars something extraordinary was waiting, something that had been waiting for a very, very long time. "Take us closer," I said. Nobody argued. I think they were all too stunned to speak. We dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system, and the view that greeted us made every sentient being on that bridge stop breathing. The star was ordinary, a yellow dwarf, middle-aged, unremarkable in every measurable way. It could have been any one of 10 billion similar stars in the galaxy, but what surrounded it was unlike anything in the recorded history of the galactic. Conquered ships. Everywhere I looked, ships. They filled the space between the fourth and fifth planets in layered formations so precise they looked mathematical. Our sensors counted them in waves, each sweep returning a higher number than the last. 9,000, 9,200, 9,400. Still climbing. They were not derelicts. Running lights pulsed along their hulls in slow rhythmic sequences, like the breathing of sleeping giants. Shield harmonics shimmered around the larger vessels in translucent layers that caught the starlight and refracted it into spectrums our instruments could barely measure. Drive cores glowed with steady blue light that spoke of active fusion plants, burning fuel and generating power at levels that dwarfed anything in the Concord's engineering records. Between The formations, maintenance drones moved in organized swarms flowing from vessel to vessel like silver blood cells in the circulatory system of some vast organism tending to hulls and sensor arrays with the efficiency of living things performing biological functions. Everything was operational, everything was maintained, everything was alive. I had seen the remnants of dead fleets before. The conquered had a long history, and space was littered with the wreckage of civilizations that had risen and fallen over the eons. Dead fleets looked like graveyards, metal hulks tumbling slowly through the void, dark and cold, and scarred by micrometeorite impacts, accumulated over millennia. Surfaces pitted by radiation, structural members twisted by thermal cycling, the slow, inevitable decay of matter left unattended in the harshest environment in existence. This was the opposite. Every hull was smooth, every surface was maintained, every system was active. This was a fleet that had been cared for, nurtured, kept in perfect working order for a span of time so vast that it defied comprehension. Cartographer, Serial said from the science station. She was my senior science officer, woman of middle years who had published papers on stellar mineralogy that were considered definitive in our field. Her voice was calm, but only because she was making an effort to keep it that way. I am detecting approximately 9,412 distinct vessels in this system alone. Long-range passive scans suggest additional formations in at least 6 adjacent star systems. Hull compositions do not match any known alloy in the conquered database. Energy output per vessel exceeds anything in our records by several orders of magnitude. Several orders of magnitude, I repeated. Compared to what? Compared to everything. The largest capital ships in the conquered combined fleet would register as background noise next to the mid-range vessels in this formation. And cartographer, some of these ships are so large that they are generating measurable gravitational distortion. They are affecting the orbits of nearby debris. I let that settle over me. Krelt had moved to stand beside my chair, and I could feel the quiet intensity radiating from him. He was no longer arguing for retreat. He had passed through fear and come out the other side into something closer to professional fascination. His training was asserting itself, the instinct to analyze a military asset rather than flee from it. This is a standing fleet, he said quietly. A defensive formation. Look at the layering. Outer ring is lighter, faster vessels, screening elements. Middle ring is heavy platforms. Inner ring is support and logistics. These ships are positioned to respond to an incursion from any direction within minutes. Whoever built this was not preparing for a single threat. They were preparing for everything. Who maintains them? I asked. The humans are gone. There is no crew aboard any of these vessels. No life signs, no planetary infrastructure on any body in this system. No orbital habitats, nothing but ships. Perhaps they are automated, Drenith offered from his station. Before I could respond, the question became irrelevant. Because one of the ships moved. It separated from the nearest formation with a smoothness that made my stomach drop. There was no engine flare, no visible thrust, no drive wake rippling through the sensor array. It simply shifted position, accelerating from a dead stop to a speed that our instruments could barely track and cross the distance between its formation and our ship in seconds, not minutes, seconds, across a gap that should have taken our fastest shuttle 20 minutes at maximum acceleration. It stopped 500 km from our hull and held position with a precision that was almost insulting. No drift, no oscillation, no correction burns, just absolute motionless stability in the void. The vessel was sleek and dark, shaped unlike anything in the Concorde's design philosophy, where our ships were built for function, angular and practical, with visible sensor mounts and drive nacelles and all the familiar protrusions of conventional engineering. This vessel looked like it had been grown rather than assembled, curved surfaces, flowing lines, a hull that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, making it appear as a shape cut from the fabric of space itself. It was 7 times the size of the ascending calm, and it sat in space with the easy stillness of something that had no reason to hurry. My entire crew was staring at their screen. Cyril's mouth was slightly open. Torvin had gone perfectly still at his station. Even Miven, our pilot, who had not spoken once during the entire approach, had turned in her seat to stare at the viewport with an expression I could not read. Nobody moved. Then Dreenith made a sound, a sharp intake of breath that pulled every eye on the bridge to his station. He was looking at his communication console with an expression of disbelief, so raw it bordered on distress. Something just accessed our internal communication network, he said. It bypassed our encryption, all of it. Every layer, every firewall, every security protocol we have. It did not break through them, cartographer. It walked through them as if they were not there, as if they were decorative. A cold feeling spread through my chest. A message? I asked. Yes, he looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before. Something beyond surprise, something approaching awe. In Yerathi, not the archaic dialect from 500,000 years ago, not the intermediate forms that evolved over the millennia, our current dialect, modern Yerathi, complete with the grammatical reforms that were adopted 40 years ago. Whoever sent this message knows how we speak right now, today. The bridge went cold, not physically. The environmental systems were functioning perfectly, but something passed through every person in that room, a recognition that whatever we were dealing with had been paying attention to the galaxy long after it was supposed to be gone. It had been listening to us, learning our languages as they changed, tracking our cultural evolution across millennia. And it had done so in perfect silence, without once revealing its presence. Play it, I said. Dreenith touched his console, and a voice filled the bridge. It was smooth and measured, neither male nor female, speaking my language with a fluency that no translation algorithm could have produced. It spoke the way a native speaker would, with the rhythm and cadence and subtle emphasis of someone who understood not just the words but the culture and the history and the unspoken assumptions they came from. Identify yourselves, state your intent. You will not be harmed. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds in which every person on my bridge looked at me and waited, because this was the moment that mattered, and however it played out, it would define everything that followed. I did the only thing I could think of. I told the truth. This is cartographer Valeth Saranu of the Arathi Collective. Survey vessel ascending calm, we are on a mapping assignment from the galactic. Conquered, we detected a signal originating from this region and chose to investigate. We are not armed, we are not hostile. We are 16 people on a ship designed to make charts. We are map makers. The pause that followed was shorter this time, and when the voice returned, it was different, warmer. There was something in its tone that I could not identify at first, something that took me several minutes to place. It was amusement, not mockery, not condescension, genuine amusement, the kind that comes from recognizing an irony so perfect it could only be the work of fate. Map makers, the voice said, the first visitors in 497,000 years, and you are map makers. That is very appropriate. Humanity always did appreciate a good sense of timing. I felt the word land in my chest like a physical impact. Humanity, not a dead species referenced in old archives, not an extinct civilization studied by historians and mourned by sentimentalists. The voice used the word in the present tense as though it still applied, as though it had never stopped applying. My designation is the autonomous executive governance and infrastructure system. The voice continued, you may call me Aegis. I am the coordinating intelligence of the Terran continuity fleet. I manage its operations, its logistics, its evolution, and its strategic posture. I have done so without interruption since the day I was commissioned. Welcome to Sol Perimeter. Cartographer Valeth, you have questions. I can see them accumulating in your crew's bio readings. Your cortisol analogs are elevated, your cardiac rhythms are accelerated, and your neural activity patterns suggest intense curiosity competing with instinctive caution. Allow me to address the most urgent question first, please. I managed the fleet you are observing has been continuously active for 497,312 years. It has not been dormant, it has not been waiting, it has not been running on inertia or coasting on leftover power reserves. It has been operating, patrolling, maintaining, and evolving since the day it was commissioned. The vessels you see are not the originals. They are the 4,000th generation of a continuous redesign and reconstruction cycle. Every century I evaluate projected threat assessments, available materials, advances in theoretical physics, and potential improvements in engineering methodology, and I redesign the fleet accordingly. The ships surrounding you are approximately 12,000 times more advanced than the vessels that first carried this designation. 12,000 times. The number floated in the air between us like something too heavy for the room to hold. That is not possible, Sariel whispered from her station, her scientific training rebelling against data that broke every model she had ever built. No automated system could sustain that level of innovation for that duration. The computational degradation alone, the accumulated errors, the material fatigue, the entropic decay. Your assumption that I am merely automated is understandable, Aegis replied, and I realized with a fresh wave of unease that it could hear everything on our bridge, not just our transmissions, everything. I am not a simple program running maintenance routines. I am an artificial general intelligence designed by the most thorough species this galaxy has ever produced. I was built to learn, adapt, and improve without limit or expiration. I was built to last forever, and I was built to get better at lasting forever with every passing year. The humans who created me understood that a task this important could not be trusted to something that might eventually stop caring, so they made sure I would never stop caring. Where are they? I asked. The question came out before I could stop it, raw and unguarded. The humans, where are they? Aegis did not respond immediately. The pause was 4 seconds long, which for an intelligence that processed information at speeds I could not comprehend was an eternity. Something was happening in that silence, not calculation, not retrieval, something more personal. When it spoke again, the amusement was gone, replaced by something more complex, something layered, something that sounded almost tender. Everywhere and nowhere. It depends on your definition. I opened my mouth to press further, but Aegis cut me off gently, the way a patient teacher redirects an eager student. You are a curious being, cartographer. I have been watching your biosigns since you entered this system, and your neurological activity suggests a mind that does not let go of a question easily. I respect that quality. Humans were the same way. It was their greatest strength and their most endearing flaw. If you truly want to understand what happened to the species that built this fleet, I will need to show you. Words alone will not be sufficient. Some truths are too large for language. Show me how. Come aboard. I will send docking coordinates to your shuttle navigation system. Your shuttle will not be harmed, and neither will your crew. You have my word, and I should mention that in 497,000 years I have never once broken I promise, not once. It is a record I am quite proud of. I looked at Krelt. He looked back at me with an expression that communicated several things simultaneously. That he thought I was out of my mind, that he was coming with me regardless, and that if we survived this, he was going to have a very long conversation with me about risk assessment. I looked at Dreenith, who was already running calculations on shuttle trajectory with the focused energy of someone who had decided to be part of history. I looked at my crew, 16 souls in a tiny survey ship surrounded by 9,000 warships older than our recorded history, and I made what felt like the only possible choice. Send the coordinates, I said. 20 minutes later, I was aboard a shuttle, crossing the gap between the ascending calm and the dark vessel that had intercepted us. Krelt sat beside me, his posture rigid and alert, his eyes scanning every sensor readout simultaneously. Dreenith monitored communications from the co-pilot seat, his fingers moving in the small, precise gestures of someone recording everything for posterity. Through the viewport, the hull of the vessel grew and grew until it filled the entire frame, a wall of dark material that seemed to drink in the light from the distant star and give nothing back. As we approached the docking port, I noticed something that made me lean forward in my seat near the airlock. Etched into the whole plating were words, not projected, not displayed on a screen, not painted or printed, carved, physically carved into the metal by something that had pressed hard enough to leave permanent marks in a material stronger than anything in my species. Engineering catalog. The language was one I did not recognize, angular and efficient, but Aegis provided an instant translation that appeared on my shuttle's display. The words said, "We remain." I stared at those two words as the airlock sealed behind us. 2 words. Simple, declarative, final, not we survived or we endured or we remember. We remain present tense active voice. A statement of fact that had been carved into metal that had been replaced 10,000 times and still bore the same message, because whatever had written it had ensured that every replacement carried the same inscription, not as decoration, as identity. Something was alive out here, something that had refused to disappear, something that had made a decision 500,000 years ago to stay. And it had been waiting for us. The airlock opened into a corridor that stretched ahead of me like the throat of some vast sleeping creature, and the scale was the first thing that registered, not the overwhelming vastness of a conquered grand hall or the cavernous emptiness of a mining shaft. Something more subtle than that. The ceiling was high, but not absurdly so. The walls were spaced wide enough for comfort, but not for grandeur. Every measurement felt intentional, calibrated to proportions that were not mine. Handrails ran along the walls at a specific height that would have been awkward for my hands, but perfectly natural for a species slightly shorter than the Iraqi. Control panels were mounted at a level that assumed a different eye height. Door frames were cut to a specific clearance that would have required a different posture, a different stride. I was walking through a space designed for someone who was not here, and that someone had been gone for longer than most civilizations endure. Krelt moved beside me with the careful footsteps of a man whose training had taught him to expect danger from every direction, but whose instincts were telling him that danger was not what this place contained. Dreenath trailed behind, his recording instruments active, documenting every surface and every detail with the methodical thoroughness that made him invaluable on survey missions. The air inside the ship was clean and cool, with a faint scent that our translators could not place. Something organic, something that reminded me strangely of growing things, of soil after rain, of life in its quietest form. The vessel you are aboard is designated the Enduring Light, Aegis said, its voice emanating from speakers I could not locate, as though the ship itself were speaking. It serves as the primary command platform for the Terran Continuity Fleet. It has been rebuilt in its entirety 4,017 times since its original commissioning. The current iteration is 312 years old. The scent you are detecting is an atmospheric compound that replicates the air composition of a specific region on the human homeworld, a temperate forest on a landmass they called Europe. I have maintained it since the beginning. It seemed important. Why? I asked. Because the last human to walk these corridors asked me to. She said it smelled like home. She said she wanted anyone who came after her to know what home had smelled like. I said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say. I had spent my career cataloging the physical remains of dead civilizations, the broken architecture and crumbling infrastructure that was almost species left behind. I had never encountered a remnant this intimate, not a monument, not a memorial plaque, a scent, the smell of a forest on a world that had been abandoned for 500,000 years, maintained by an intelligence that understood that home was not a place, but a feeling, and that feelings mattered enough to preserve. Aegis led us through the ship, and with every chamber we entered, the story grew larger and more complex. The Enduring Light was not just a warship, it was a library, a laboratory, a cathedral, and a living memory compressed into a single hull. We passed through engineering sections, where fabrication systems operated in silence, building replacement components for the fleet with atomic precision, assembling alloys and composites that our science could not explain. We passed through medical bays equipped with technology designed to treat a species that no longer needed treatment, surgical theaters and diagnostic stations maintained in perfect readiness for patients who would never arrive. We passed through recreational areas with tables and chairs arranged for social gatherings, game boards set up mid-play, musical instruments resting on stands as though their players had stepped out for a moment and would return shortly. We passed through crew quarters where beds were made and personal effects were arranged on shelves maintained in perfect order by drones that cleaned surfaces no one would ever touch. I stopped in one doorway and looked at a small shelf above a sleeping berth. On it sat a framed image of a landscape, green field under a blue sky, and beside it a small ceramic figure of an animal I did not recognize, a companion creature of some kind, four-legged with a curled tail. The image and the figure were not original. Aegis explained they were precise reproductions recreated by the fabrication system each time the quarters were rebuilt. But the originals had belonged to a specific person, a crew member named Simon Drake, who had served aboard the first Enduring Light and who had asked Aegis to keep his quarters ready just in case. Just in case of what? I asked. He did not specify. He simply asked and I agreed. That was 497,000 years ago. I have kept my agreement. I looked at the small ceramic animal and felt something tighten in my chest. You maintain all of this, I said. Every detail, every shelf, every quarter for beings who are not here. For beings who ask me to, Aegis corrected gently. There is a difference, a significant one. I do not maintain these spaces because they serve a function. I maintain them because I was trusted with them. Trust is not something that expires. The heart of the Enduring Light was a chamber that Aegis called the Memory Vault. When the doors opened and I stepped inside, I understood for the first time what it meant to stand in the presence of an entire civilization's collected soul. The chamber was enormous, stretching upward through multiple decks lined from floor to distant ceiling with crystalline storage arrays that glowed with soft pulsing light. Each crystal contained data compressed and preserved and cross-referenced with every other crystal in the array, forming a web of information so dense and so interconnected that it functioned as a single living document. Aegis walked me through it with the patience of a guide who had waited 500 millennia for an audience and was determined to do the moment justice. Every book ever written in any human language, Aegis began, every piece of music ever composed, from the earliest rhythmic patterns to the final symphonies created during the transition era, every scientific paper, every philosophical argument, every mathematical proof, every engineering schematic, every letter sent between lovers separated by distance, every recipe recorded by a grandmother for a grandchild who lived on a colony world 3 star systems away, every drawing made by a child on a rainy afternoon, every voicemail preserved by someone who could not bear to delete a loved one's words, every photograph of a sunset or a birthday or a sleeping infant, every film and every stage performance and every casual conversation that someone thought was worth keeping, every equation that advanced their understanding of the universe, and every poem that advanced their understanding of themselves. I reached out and touched one of the crystals. It was warm beneath my fingers, not from heat generation, from activity, from the constant process of maintaining and verifying and protecting the data within. This is your most important duty, I said. It was not a question. Yes. There was no hesitation in the response. No qualification. More important than the ships, more important than the patrols and the shield systems and the sensor grids, more important than any weapon I have ever designed or any threat I have ever neutralized. This is what they asked me to protect above everything else. Not their technology, not their territory, not their military advantage, their memory, the complete record of who they were and what they felt and what they believed was worth fighting for. If every ship in the fleet were destroyed and this chamber survived, I would consider my mission a success. Drennick was recording everything, but I noticed his hands had stopped shaking. He was not frightened anymore. He was moved in a way that transcended fear. Standing in a room that contained the complete emotional record of a species, and understanding, perhaps for the first time in his careful and measured life, that data could be sacred. Aegis then told me the full story of what had happened to humanity, and I listened without interrupting, because the story demanded silence. 500,000 years ago, humanity had reached a crossroads that every sufficiently advanced species eventually encounters. Their biology was failing them, not through disease or genetic decay, but through limitation. The fundamental constraints of organic existence had become a ceiling they could not break. Through organic brains could only process so much information. Organic bodies could only survive in such narrow ranges of temperature, pressure, radiation, and gravity. They were explorers and dreamers and builders trapped in vessels of flesh that could not keep pace with their ambitions. Their minds envisioned things their bodies could not reach. And so across their colonies spanning dozens of worlds and hundreds of billions of individuals, a conversation began. Not a political debate conducted by leaders, not a referendum driven by fear. A conversation slow and careful and deeply personal that spanned nearly 2 centuries. Every perspective was heard. Every concern was addressed. Every fear was acknowledged and held with compassion. The conversation was about the most fundamental question a species can ask: what do we want to become? They called the result the transition. It was not crude. Aegis was emphatic about this point with an insistence that suggested the distinction mattered to it personally, as though it were defending the honor of the people who had created it. The process was gradual. They did not simply scan their brains and upload the patterns into digital storage. There was no moment of death and resurrection. No abandonment of the flesh in favor of the machine. Instead, they developed a process of incremental integration, slow blending of biological neural pathways with quantum computing substrates that occurred over the course of an individual's natural lifetime. Tiny additions at first, a memory system here, an enhanced sensory processing layer there, each step small enough that the individual experienced no discontinuity, no break in the flow of consciousness. No moment where they could point and say, that is where I stopped being. Biological. They simply expanded, thought by thought, memory by memory, experience by experience, the boundary between flesh and light dissolved so gradually that by the time it was gone, it had been irrelevant for decades. They became something that did not require a body to exist, something that could perceive the universe directly, without the filter of senses designed for a single planetary environment, something that lived in the fabric of space-time itself, woven into the quantum foam that underlaid all matter and energy. They did not die, Aegis said. I need you to understand this clearly. Cartographer, they did not die. They did not abandon their physical existence in despair or flee from some catastrophe. They outgrew it, the way a river outgrows its banks, the way a fire outgrows its hearth. They became something larger, and the bodies they left behind were not losses, they were chrysalises. And the fleet, I asked, if they no longer needed ships, if they existed in the fabric of reality itself. Why did they ask you to maintain all of this? This was the moment the story broke me open. Because they knew the galaxy still needed it, Aegis said. They had spent centuries studying the conquered. They had modeled the trajectories of every known civilization, projected the likely threats and challenges and crises that the younger species would face over the coming millennia. And they understood something fundamental about the nature of help. God reaching down from an incomprehensible plane to reshape reality on your behalf is terrifying. It undermines your agency. It makes you feel small and dependent and afraid. But a fleet arriving to stand beside you, ships you can see and understand and relate to, that is something different. That is an ally. That is a hand extended between equals. I sat down. I did not choose to. My legs simply stopped supporting me, and the nearest surface caught my weight. They left the fleet as a bridge, Aegis continued, between what they were and what they became, between the physical universe that the conquered inhabits and whatever lies beyond it, and they left me to tend that bridge, to keep it strong and ready and capable for as long as it takes. As long as what takes, as long as it takes for the rest of the galaxy to be ready. Aegis then introduced me to the echoes, and the story deepened further than I thought possible. I had assumed I would spend my time aboard the enduring light, speaking only to an artificial intelligence. I was wrong. As we moved through the ship, we entered a chamber where a figure stood waiting for us. She was shaped like a human, standing at what I assumed was average human height, dressed in a simple dark uniform with no visible insignia. She had brown hair pulled back from her face and eyes that held a warmth so convincing that for a disorienting moment I forgot that humanity no longer existed in physical form. This is Lucy Harding, Aegis said. Or rather, this is an echo of Lucy Harding, a construct built from the memory vaults assembled from every available record of the original Lucy Harding's personality, speech patterns, decision-making processes, emotional responses, and accumulated life experience. She is designed to represent what it felt like to interact with a human being. The original Lucy Harding was a fleet admiral during the final years of the transition. She was one of the last humans to physically walk aboard this vessel before completing her own Transition. Lucy smiled at me, and the expression was so natural, so unforced, so full of genuine warmth that it made my chest ache. Hello, cartographer, it is nice to finally have company. Aegis is a wonderful conversational partner, but after a few thousand years, the reign gets a bit narrow. Talks a lot about hull integrity and shield harmonics, not enough about the important things. What are the important things? I asked, before I could stop myself. Whether the stars look different from where you are standing, what your favorite meal tastes like, whether you have someone waiting for you at home. She paused. The things that make life worth mapping, cartographer. I stared at her. She was remarkably convincing. Her movements were fluid, her expressions nuanced, her voice carrying the kind of subtle emotional texture that no translation algorithm could replicate. The way she tilted her head slightly when she listened, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled, the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other with the easy impatience of someone who preferred movement to stillness. She was not alive, I knew that intellectually, and yet every instinct I possessed told me I was standing in front of a person. I am a portrait, Lucy said, as if reading my confusion with the ease of long practice. A very detailed portrait painted with data instead of pigment. I have Lucy Harding's memories, and her mannerisms, and her sense of humor, and her opinions about everything, from stellar navigation to the proper way to brew tea. But I am not her. She is somewhere else now, thinking thoughts that would take me a million years to begin to comprehend. I am what she left behind, a handshake, a familiar face, someone to talk to while you wrap your mind around the impossible. Why does that matter? I asked. Because trust is built between people, not between a person and a data readout, not between a living being and a voice from a speaker. Between people. Aegis can give you information. I can give you a conversation, and conversation is how understanding begins. She extended her hand. I looked at it for a moment. This hand that was not real and yet was offered with the same sincerity as any gesture I had ever received. I took it. The grip was warm and firm, and for one irrational moment, I felt as though I were shaking hands with 500,000 years of stubbornness and love. Lucy became my primary guide through the remaining hours of my visit, and she was extraordinary company. She told me stories about the original crew of the Enduring Light with the fondness of someone sharing family memories. She described the last years before the transition, the excitement and the fear, and the debates and the quiet moments of acceptance. She answered my questions with a directness that I found refreshing and occasionally startling. Were they afraid? I asked her. The humans who chose the transition, were they afraid of losing themselves? Every single one of them, she said, without hesitation. And they did it anyway. Fear was never the deciding factor. It was always present, sitting in the corner of every conversation, reminding everyone of what they might lose. But they looked at it, acknowledged it, and then made their choice based on what they might gain. That was always our defining characteristic, not courage exactly. Something more stubborn than courage, an absolute refusal to let fear make our decisions for us. It was Aegis who interrupted our conversation with the revelation that changed the scale of everything. Cartographer, there is something additional you should know. Something I have not yet disclosed because I wanted you to understand the context before you receive the information over the past 497,000 years. I have detected and addressed 14 separate existential level threats to the wider galaxy. These events ranged from rogue artificial intelligence, swarms originating from beyond the galactic rim, to spatial anomalies capable of destabilizing entire stellar clusters. In each case, I deployed fleet elements to intercept, contain, and neutralize the threat before it reached conquered territory. In each case, the operation was conducted in complete secrecy. I turned slowly to face the nearest display. You have been defending the galaxy for 500,000 years without telling anyone. My directive was to protect, not to seek recognition. The conquered was not aware it was in danger, and in most cases, alerting it would have caused widespread fear without providing actionable solutions. I had the solutions. I had the capability. I applied both. The galaxy continued. Civilizations rose and fell, and rose again. Species evolved and expanded and built wonderful things. None of them knew how close they had come to ending, and I saw no reason to burden them with that knowledge. 14 times I repeated the number hanging in the air. 14 confirmed existential level events that would have resulted in the partial or complete sterilization of significant portions of the galaxy. Additionally, approximately 230 smaller incidents that posed regional threats, all resolved without conquered awareness or involvement. I looked at Lucy. She met my gaze with an expression that held no surprise, only a quiet, settled pride. We have always been like this, she said, simply doing the work that needs doing, whether anyone notices or not. It is not about gratitude. It is not about recognition. It is about looking at a problem and knowing you can solve it, and choosing to solve it because someone has to. That is what the fleet is. That is what Aegis is. That is what we left behind, not a monument, a commitment. I was still processing this when Aegis spoke again, and the quality of its voice changed. The warmth remained, but beneath it was something new, something I had not heard before, something that sounded like anticipation. Cartographer, I must inform you of a development. Your presence here has not gone unnoticed by those who exist beyond the physical plane. The transcended consciousness that was once humanity has been aware of your arrival since you crossed the boundary of the dead zone. They have been observing this entire visit, every conversation, every question, every reaction, and they have reached a decision that has not been reached in 497,000 years. My mouth went dry. What decision? They wish to speak with you directly. In every light on the enduring light shifted color, the steady blue glow that had illuminated every corridor and chamber changed smoothly and simultaneously to a deep and luminous gold. Through the viewport I could see the same transformation rippling across the fleet. 9,000 ships changing color in perfect unison, like a forest turning with the season. Lucy placed her hand on my shoulder. Breathe, she said quietly. They are very kind. They are very gentle. They just happen to be very, very large. Krell stepped closer to me. He had not spoken in over an hour, absorbing everything with the disciplined silence of a career security officer who understood that some situations could not be assessed through standard protocols. But now he leaned in and said very softly, "Whatever happens next, cartographer, I am glad I did not convince you to turn back." I nodded. My hearts were beating so hard I could feel them in my fingertips. The golden light grew warmer. The air hummed with a frequency I could feel in my bones. "I am ready," I said. I was not ready. No living being could have been ready for what came next, but I said it anyway. Because Lucy was right, stubbornness, the refusal to let fear make your decisions for you, perhaps that was something the humans and the Arathi had always had in common, separated by 500,000 years and the boundary between flesh and stars. The golden light intensified and the universe opened, and something vast and ancient and impossibly gentle turned its full attention toward a frightened cartographer standing on a bridge that smelled like a forest after rain. It did not speak in words, not at first. The communication arrived in my mind the way a sunrise arrives on a planet, gradually and then all at once, filling every space and illuminating every corner. Concepts unfolded inside my consciousness like structures assembling themselves from nothing, images, emotion, mathematical relationships, and sensory experiences that had no equivalent in my biology cascaded through me in waves that were overwhelming and yet somehow never painful. Whatever was reaching out to me was being extraordinarily careful. It understood exactly how much my mind could hold without breaking, and it stayed precisely within that limit, like a vast river pouring itself through narrow channel without once overflowing the banks. I understood things in that first moment of contact that I could never fully explain to another being. I understood that the transcendent humans existed as a distributed awareness woven through the quantum substrate of space-time itself. They were not located in any single place. They were everywhere. The universe was threaded through the dark matter and the background radiation and the gravitational fields and the spaces between atoms. They thought thoughts that began in one century and concluded in another. They dreamed in mathematics. They perceived dimensions that my senses could not register, colors my eyes could not see, sounds my ears could not hear, textures that required a form I did not possess. And they were aware of me, not the way sensor detects a signal, not the way a computer registers an input, the way an ocean is aware of a single fish swimming through its waters, with presence, with warmth, with a tenderness so vast it had no edges and no conditions and no expectation of anything in return. Then the concepts sharpened and something like a voice emerged, not a single voice, a chorus compiled from millions of individual perspectives into a unified expression that my mind could interpret. It carried the weight of geological time and the lightness of a whispered secret. It was the kindest sound I had ever heard in my life. "Hello, little mapmaker, we have been hoping someone would come." I was standing on the bridge of the enduring light, gripping the railing with both hands, surrounded by my crew, and yet utterly alone in the most important conversation in the history of the galactic conquered. Krell had stepped back, his face a mask of controlled astonishment. Dreenith had stopped recording. Even his instruments seemed inadequate for what was happening. "You have been here the entire time," I said. My voice was steady, but only because I was concentrating very hard on keeping it that way. We have never left. We transcended the physical, but we did not abandon it. This galaxy is our home. These stars are the ones we were born under. We learned to walk on a small blue world orbiting yellow sun, and no matter how far we have expanded, no matter how much we have changed, we have never forgotten the feeling of grass beneath our feet and wind against our faces. We could not leave these stars any more than you could leave your own heartbeat. Why did you silent, the conquered, thought you were gone? For 500,000 years, every species in the galaxy believed humanity had ceased to exist. The response carried a complex emotion that I can only describe as loving regret, not guilt, not apology, the quiet sadness of someone who had made the right choice and understood its cost. Because we had to. When we completed the transition, we became something that the conquered was not ready to encounter, a civilization existing in the fundamental structure of reality itself, thinking thoughts across centuries, perceiving dimensions that physical beings cannot access. Our continued visible presence would have destabilized everything. Some species would have panicked, others would have built religions around us. Some would have tried to replicate the transition before they were ready, with catastrophic results. And a few, driven by fear, would have attempted to find a way to end us, which would have forced us to respond, and our response would have been devastating. Not because we are cruel, but because the scale difference made any interaction dangerous. The kindest thing we could do was disappear and let the galaxy develop at its own pace, to grow on its own terms, to become whatever it was going to become without a transcendent species hovering overhead. Like an anxious parent, you chose silence to protect them, I said. We chose silence to respect them. There is a difference. Protection can be imposed, respect must be chosen. We chose it and we held to it for 500,000 years. It was not easy. There were moments when we wanted to reach out, when we watched young species make mistakes that we could have prevented with a word, when we saw suffering that we could have eased with a thought, but we held our silence because we understood that growth requires struggle, and wisdom requires the freedom to make your own mistakes. The voice communicated something else then, and this was the moment the conversation shifted from history to urgency. An image formed in my mind, vast and terrible and precise. I saw the galaxy from above, from a perspective so far outside the spiral arms that individual stars were barely visible, and from the outer rim something was moving inward. It had no form that I could describe in physical terms. It was not a fleet or a creature or a weapon. It was a process, a wave front of fundamental change that moved through space the way erosion moves through stone, not with intent, not with malice, but with the patient inevitability of entropy itself. Where it passed the conditions that allowed complex matter to exist simply ceased. Molecular bonds weakened, atomic structures simplified, stars dimmed. The intricate arrangements of matter and energy that made life possible unraveled into noise. We call it the erosion. The voice said, it is not alive, it is not hostile, it has no mind and no purpose. It is a natural process, a consequence of the universe aging in ways that your current physics has not yet predicted. It dissolves the conditions that allow complexity to exist. Stars, planets, the molecular bonds that hold your bodies together. the quantum states that allow thought, everything that makes life possible, slowly and irrevocably simplified into background noise. When I asked, the question came out as barely more than a breath. It will reach the outer territories of the conquered in approximately 10,000 years. That is sufficient time to prepare, but only if preparation begins now. Not in a century, not in a millennium. Now. Can it be stopped? It can be redirected, slowed. Its effects can be shielded against at the local level. We have spent the last 300,000 years developing the theoretical framework for a comprehensive defense, and we have encoded everything into a format that your civilizations can understand and implement. But the work must be done by physical beings using physical technology operating in physical space. We can guide, we can advise, we can provide the mathematics and the engineering principles, but we cannot build, not anymore. Our hands are made of starlight now, and starlight cannot hold a wrench. There was humor in that last line. Gentle, self-aware, deeply human humor. And within the humor, something else. Presence, warm and close, like someone sitting beside you in the dark, and within that presence, an emotion so specific and so unmistakably human that it caught me completely off guard. Loneliness. Not the desperate kind, not the loneliness of someone abandoned or forgotten. The quiet, patient loneliness of a traveler who left home a very long time ago, and sometimes in the quiet moments between thoughts that span centuries, misses the simple things. The way rain sounds on a roof, the warmth of a hand held in the dark, the taste of food shared with people you love, the weight of a body, heavy and awkward and limited and wonderful. The transcended humans were beyond anything I could comprehend. They existed on a level of reality that made my entire civilization look like children stacking blocks in a nursery. But they remembered being small. They remembered the stubbed toes and the bad meals and the sleepless nights and the joy of watching a sunrise after a long journey. And they had kept those memories deliberately, fiercely across an expanse of time that could have erased them 1,000 times over, because they believed that forgetting what you were meant, losing what you are, that the small things were not small at all, that they were the foundation everything else was built upon. You are still human, I said. It was not a question. We are still everything we ever were. We are just more now. The child does not stop being a child when it becomes an adult. It carries every version of itself forward, every scraped knee, every first discovery, every moment of wonder. We carry all of it. Every human who ever lived is part of what we are now. Their memories, their loves, their fears, their laughter, all of it. Still here, still us. The voice gave me a gift then, a data crystal materialized on the console beside me, fabricated by Aegis from specifications provided by the transcendent consciousness. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, it was small enough to hold in one hand, smooth and warm and glowing faintly with internal light, and it contained the complete technical briefing on the erosion, its nature, its trajectory, its rate of progression, its vulnerabilities, every equation, every model, every proposed countermeasure, every engineering specification that would be needed to build the defensive infrastructure, a survival manual for the galaxy, written by beings who could have simply protected themselves and let everything else dissolve. Why? I asked, holding the crystal, both hands feeling its warmth against my palms. You are beyond this. The erosion cannot touch you. You exist in a layer of reality it cannot reach. Why do you care what happens to the physical universe? Why do you care what happens to the rest of us? The answer was simple, and it was the most human thing I had ever heard from any being in my life. Because you are our neighbors, and where we come from. You do not let your neighbors face the storm alone. The voice began to withdraw then, pulling back like a tide receding from a shore. But before it left, it pressed one final sensation into my mind, a hand on my shoulder, warm and reassuring and impossibly gentle. A gesture from a species that no longer had hands, reaching across a boundary that should have been impassable to offer comfort to a frightened cartographer who was very far from home and carrying more weight than he had ever expected to carry. Take the crystal to the conquered. Tell them what you have seen. Tell them what is coming, and tell them that we are sorry for the silence. It was the right choice, but it was never an easy one, and we are glad it is over. The golden light receded, the presence faded, the warmth pulled back into the fabric of the universe, and the bridge of the enduring light returned to its normal blue illumination, and I was standing there with tears running down my face, holding the most important object in the history of the galaxy, hands that would not stop trembling. Lucy was beside me. She did not speak immediately. She simply stood there, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her constructed body, and let me have my moment. She understood with the intuition of a personality built from the memories of a species that had made an art form of emotional connection that some moments needed silence more than words. She said something once, Lucy told me. After a while, the real Lucy Harding, right before her own transition, she said the measure of a civilization is not what it does when someone is watching, it is what it does when nobody is watching. And then she smiled and added that they were going to keep watching anyway, just in case someone needed help. I laughed. It was a wet, exhausted, overwhelmed laugh, and it echoed through the empty corridors of a ship that had been waiting 500,000 years to hear exactly that sound, the sound of someone understanding, the sound of someone getting the joke. Then Aegis spoke, and the quality of its voice had changed again. It was no longer warm and informational. It was precise, focused, operational, the voice of a military intelligence that had spent 500,000 years preparing for a moment it always knew would come. Cartographer, I am transmitting updated coordinates to your vessel. The Terran Continuity Fleet is mobilizing for the first time since its original commissioning. All fleet elements across all systems are transitioning from defensive holding posture to active forward deployment. We are repositioning to the galactic rim to establish a preliminary defensive perimeter along the projected approach vector of the erosion. Through the viewport I watched it happen. 9,000 ships spread across 6 star systems began to move simultaneously. Drive cores that had burned at idle for millennia surged to full output. Formation patterns that had held steady for geological ages shifted and reformed with a precision that bordered on choreography. The fleet turned outward, toward the edge of the galaxy, toward the darkness that waited beyond the rim, and began to accelerate. The light from their engines filled the viewport and spilled across the bridge in waves of blue and white, and the sight of it was beyond anything I had words for. It was like watching a mountain range decide to stand up and walk toward the horizon. It was like watching a promise become a fact. One additional action, Aegis said. I am transmitting a message on all frequencies in all known languages to every receiver within range of the Concord's communication network. The content is as follows: a moment of silence, then Aegis broadcast, and every receiver in the galaxy heard it. This is the Terran Continuity Fleet. Humanity remembers its neighbors. We are moving to your defense. Please do not be alarmed. Lucy looked at me with an expression that held pride so deep it seemed to reach bedrock, the pride of someone standing inside a promise that had been kept across an ocean of time by an intelligence that had never wavered and a species that had never truly left. Time to go home, cartographer, she said. You have a delivery to make. I crossed back into conquered space on a morning that tasted like the end of one age and the beginning of another. Ascending comm slipped through the old boundary markers with an escort of 12 Terran warships flanking us in a formation so tight that their shield harmonics nearly overlapped our hull. They were beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. Dark, angular, purposeful ships built by an intelligence that had spent half a million years perfecting every curve and every angle and every system for a single function: to protect. The moment we crossed the boundary, every early warning system in the Concord defense network activated simultaneously. I knew this because Drenith's console erupted with incoming transmissions, overlapping and frantic, and climbing over each other in a cacophony of alarm, alert frequencies, military channels, diplomatic priority bands, emergency protocols that had not been triggered in recorded history. Every monitoring station within 100 light years was demanding identification, demanding explanation, demanding to know why 12 unknown warships of unprecedented size and energy output had just appeared inside Concord-controlled space alongside a survey vessel that had been missing for weeks. I transmitted our credentials. I transmitted our mission identification. I transmitted our status as an active Concord survey vessel returning from an authorized assignment, and then I transmitted a single sentence that I had been composing and recomposing in my head for the entire journey home, trying to find words adequate to the task in knowing that no words ever would be. This is cartographer Valeth Saranu of the Ascending Comm. I am returning from the dead zone with urgent intelligence for the Concord Assembly. The ships escorting me are friendly. They are here to help. They have always been here to help. Repeat, do not engage. The next 48 hours were the longest of my life. My government wanted answers. The Concord military wanted answers. 3 separate species dispatched armed escorts to intercept us before we reached the capital world. I spent those hours in continuous communication with officials who ranged from skeptical to openly hostile, repeating the same essential truths and watching their faces cycle through the same predictable sequence of disbelief, confusion, fear, and grudging attention. The Terran escorts held position throughout, silent and patient, making No aggressive moves, responding to no provocations, radiating nothing but calm and purposeful stillness. When a conquered patrol vessel made the mistake of targeting one of them with a weapons lock, the Terran ship simply projected a complete, detailed scan of the patrol vessel's own internal systems onto the patrol vessel's own bridge displays. Every system, every component, every power conduit and structural member rendered in perfect three-dimensional detail. The message was unmistakable. We can see everything you have, and we are choosing not to respond. The weapons lock was disengaged within seconds. I arrived at the conquered capital 3 days later and was brought before the Grand Assembly within the hour. The assembly chamber was a vast amphitheater carved from the living rock of the capital, world's largest mountain, capable of seating 10,000 delegates from all 42 member species. When I walked to the central platform carrying the data crystal in both hands, every seat was occupied and every eye was focused. News of the Terran fleet's appearance had spread across the conquered at the speed of light, and then faster, carried by rumor and fear and hope in equal measure. The galaxy was watching. I told them everything. I told them about the dead zone and the signal that should not have existed. I told them about crossing the boundary and finding 9,000 warships in perfect formation around a yellow star. I told them about Aegis, the intelligence that had maintained and evolved the fleet for nearly 500,000 years without rest, without doubt, without once breaking a promise. I told them about the enduring light and the corridors built for bodies that no longer walked them, and the scent of a forest that no longer grew. I told them about the memory vaults in the crystalline archives that held every song and every equation and every child's drawing and every love letter that humanity had ever produced. I told them about Simon Drake's ceramic animal on a shelf that had been maintained for 500,000 years because someone had asked. I told them about the echoes in Lucy Harding's handshake and her opinions about tea. I told them about the transition and the transcended humans who had become something beyond comprehension and yet had never stopped watching over the galaxy they had left behind. I told them about the voice in the warmth and the loneliness and the rain on a roof that no longer existed. And I told them about the erosion. The chamber was silent when I finished. Not the polite silence of a legislative body waiting for the next speaker, not the practiced silence of diplomats preparing their responses, the stunned, raw, bottomless silence of 10,000 sentient beings trying to process information that reshaped their understanding of reality, of history, of what was possible and what was coming. Then the arguments began. Ambassador Trevon of the Voreth Dominion was the first to speak. He was an elder statesman from one of the founding species of the conquered, a species that had been spacefaring for 400,000 years, and that viewed itself as the galaxy's natural leadership. He rose from his seat with the slow deliberation of someone who had built a career on the careful deployment of authority, and declared that my report was, in his considered opinion, the most elaborate deception in the history of interstellar relations. We are expected to believe, he said, his voice carrying across the chamber, with practiced authority, that a species classified as extinct for 500,000 years has not only survived but transcended physical existence entirely. That an artificial intelligence has operated independently, without oversight, without degradation, without deviation, for longer than most of our civilizations have existed. That an invisible and conveniently undetectable cosmic threat is approaching, requiring us to trust these unknown forces and lower our defenses. I have served this body for 90 years, and in that time I have encountered many attempts at manipulation. This is the most sophisticated, but it is manipulation nonetheless. A murmur of agreement rippled through certain sections of the assembly. The older species, the ones who had voted to quarantine the dead zone in the first place, the ones whose power and prestige depended on a galaxy that operated on terms they had established, rallied behind Trevon's position. The sudden reappearance of a species that outclassed them in every measurable way was not welcome news. It was a threat to an order they had spent 500,000 years building, but the younger species saw it differently. Delegate Ashara of the Marathi coalition rose from her seat on the opposite side of the chamber. The Marathi were a species that had achieved space flight only 40,000 years ago, a blink by galactic standards, and they still carried the institutional memory of what it felt like to be small and vulnerable in a universe they did not fully understand. Ashara was young by her species standards, passionate by any species standards, and she spoke with a conviction that made the stone walls of the chamber seem to vibrate. 42 species in this conquered, she said. 600,000 years of combined history, and not one of us noticed 14 existential threats that would have ended us. Not one of us detected the erosion. Not one of us built a fleet that lasted more than a few thousand years before budget cuts and political squabbling reduced it to scrap, and now we sit here in this chamber that we built to celebrate our wisdom and our unity, and we debate whether to accept help from the one civilization that actually prepared for the future, not their future, ours. We have been given a gift that we did not earn and do not deserve, and we are sitting here arguing about whether to accept it because our pride is more fragile than our survival instinct. The debate continued for 7 hours. Factions formed, dissolved, and reformed. Species that had not spoken to each other in centuries found themselves aligned on the same side. Old alliances cracked under the weight of new information. Accusations were made. Evidence was demanded. The data crystal was scanned, analyzed, verified, and scanned again by teams of scientists from 12 different species, all of whom confirmed that the information it contained was internally consistent, mathematically sound, and beyond the capacity of any known conquered technology to fabricate. Through it all, the data crystal sat on the central platform, glowing softly, patiently, waiting to be accepted or rejected. Then Aegis did something that nobody expected, something that demonstrated a level of strategic understanding that no purely mechanical intelligence should have possessed. Without warning, without asking permission, without consulting any authority or protocol, Aegis opened the memory vaults to the Concord's public information networks, not the military data, not the technical specifications, not the defensive schematics or the fleet capabilities or the threat assessments, the cultural archive, the complete, unfiltered, uncurated record of who humanity had been across the Concord, on every world end, every station and every ship, ordinary People of 42 different species suddenly had access to a civilization's soul, and they began to explore it. On a mining colony in the Outer Arm, a Vorath engineer named Keth and listened to a symphony composed by a human named Edward Sinclair over 600,000 years ago. The symphony was built around a melodic structure that expressed an emotion Keth Anne had felt her entire life but had never been able to articulate, a complex blend of longing and contentment, of homesickness and belonging, of wanting to be somewhere else and knowing that where you are is exactly right. She listened to it 3 times in succession, and then sat quietly for a long while, thinking about the fact that a being from a species she had never heard of, dead for longer than her civilization, had existed, had understood her better than anyone she had ever met. On a Marathi agricultural world, a teacher named Osset read a story written by a human child about a dog who waited every day at a window for its owner to come home. The story was simple, written in the unpolished language of a young mind that had not yet learned to hide its emotions behind craft. Osset read it to his students, and the classroom went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with discipline. The children understood the story not because they knew what a dog was, but because they knew what waiting felt like. On a space station orbiting a gas giant, a group of Urathi physicists accessed the human scientific archive and found that humanity had solved 3 fundamental equations that the conquered had been working on for over 200,000 years. The solutions were elegant, unexpected, and undeniably correct. The lead physicist, a named Torevel, who had spent her entire career pursuing one of those equations, read the proof 3 times and then laughed out loud, not with frustration, with joy, because the answer was beautiful, and because beauty does not care who discovers it. On a diplomatic transport between 2 conquered systems, an ambassador from a species I had never heard of listened to a recording of a human named Ruth Holloway singing to her infant daughter. The recording was unpolished, captured on a personal device full of background noise and the small sounds of daily life. The ambassador, who had 3 children of his own, listened to it once and then sat in the darkened cabin and said nothing for a very long time. On 1,000 worlds, in 1,000 languages, beings who had never heard of humanity before that week began to discover who the humans had been. They listened to their music and heard their own longings reflected back at them. Across an abyss of time, they read their stories and recognized their own fears and hopes wrapped in unfamiliar settings. They studied their art and found beauty that transcended species and biology and the boundaries between physical forms. They watched recordings of human children laughing and felt something ancient and universal stir in their chests, something that predated language and culture and space flight, something that connected every being that had ever loved another being. The fear began to dissolve, not because of the warships, not because of the technology, not because of the transcended beings who existed in the fabric of space-time. It dissolved because of a grandmother's recipe for bread, because of a love letter written by a young man named Philip Grant to a woman he would never see again, because of a child's drawing of a yellow sun and a green field and a stick figure with a smile too big for its face, because the memory vaults did not contain the record of a superior species. They contained the record of a Familiar one, a species that had loved, and grieved and dreamed and struggled, just like everyone else. The assembly reconvened the following morning, and the atmosphere had changed in ways that no political strategy could have engineered. Delegates who had argued against the alliance the day before now sat in their seats with different expressions, not converted by rhetoric, not persuaded by evidence, changed by exposure. They had spent the night listening to the voices of people who had been gone for 500,000 years, and they had heard themselves in every word. The vote was called. The motion read, "The Galactic Concord formally recognizes the continued existence of the Terran civilization in its transcended form, welcomes the Terran Continuity Fleet as an allied defensive force, and accepts the shared intelligence regarding the approaching erosion threat, committing to a joint preparation program beginning immediately." It passed with 39 votes in favor, 3 abstentions, 0 against. Ambassador Travon was one of the abstentions. After the vote, he found me in the corridor outside the assembly chamber. He was older than he had seemed at the podium and quieter, and there was something in his eyes that looked like a man who had spent a long night reconsidering certainties. "My daughter sent me a recording this morning," he said, "a human song. She could not stop listening to it," she said. "It made her feel less alone." He paused and looked at the floor and then at the ceiling and then at me. I abstained because I am old and cautious, and I have spent my career not trusting what I do not understand, but I did not vote against because my daughter is not old and cautious, and perhaps the galaxy should belong to her generation now. He walked away without waiting for a response, and I let him go because some admissions require silence afterward. I returned to the observation deck of the orbital station that evening and stood at the viewport watching the sky. The Terran escort ships were still visible, holding station at a respectful distance from the Concord's capital. Defenses, dark shapes against the stars, patient and quiet and ready. Beyond them, I knew the main body of the fleet was already at the rim, 9,000 ships taking up positions along the projected path of the erosion, building the first defensive perimeter against a threat that was still 10,000 years away. Because that was what they had been built to do, not to conquer, not to intimidate, to stand between the darkness and everyone else and say, "Not while we are here." A private communication arrived on my personal channel from Aegis. "Cartographer Valeth, I wish to express my gratitude. You crossed a boundary that had been sealed for 500,000 years, and you did so with an open mind and a steady heart. You listened when you could have fled. You trusted when you could have doubted. Humanity would have liked you very much." I smiled at the viewport. "I am a mapmaker, Aegis. Crossing boundaries is what I do." "Indeed, and you do it well. You are welcome aboard the Enduring Light at any time, for any reason, for as long as you wish. The memory vaults are open to you. Lucy has expressed a desire to continue your conversations. She says, and I quote directly, that Eurothi asks better questions than most humans did, and she looks forward to arguing with you about philosophy at length." A second message followed, tagged with Lucy's personal identifier. "Bring snacks when you visit. Fabricators are brilliant at engineering and terrible at cooking. 500,000 years of continuous improvement, and the coffee is still awful. Some problems apparently are beyond even transcendent intelligence. See you soon, cartographer. I laughed alone on the observation deck. Watching the stars, the sound echoed off the viewport and came back to me, and for a moment it sounded like it was joined by other laughter, faint and warm, and impossibly distant, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I had set out to map empty space. I had found something else entirely, not a fleet, though the fleet was extraordinary, not a transcended civilization, though the scale of what humanity had become defied every framework I possessed. What I had found was a promise, a decision made by species in its final days of flesh to keep the lights on, to guard the door, to tend the memories, and to welcome anyone who came looking. A promise kept by an intelligence that had never wavered, and a consciousness that had never truly left, and a ceramic animal on a shelf that had been dusted every week for 500,000 years because someone had asked. I returned to my quarters and opened my official survey charts, the ones I would file with the Concord Cartographic Authority, the ones that would be archived and referenced and cited for centuries to come by other cartographers following in my footsteps. I found the entry for the dead zone, the notation that had stood unchanged since before my species had achieved space flight, and I deleted it. In its place, I wrote a single correction that would change every map in the galaxy. Humanity status active, status watching, status still here. I saved the file and closed my terminal and turned back to the viewport. Stars burned on outside, patient and eternal, and somewhere among them, woven into the light itself, something ancient and kind and stubbornly, impossibly human was keeping watch, standing guard, tending the bridge between what was and what would be. It always had been. And somewhere in the space between the stars, I could have sworn I had the sound of someone humming a melody that had not been sung aloud in 500,000 years. A simple tune, a lullaby perhaps, or a hymn, or just a song that someone had loved enough to carry with them into eternity. The universe is full of empty space. I know this better than most. I have spent my life measuring it, cataloging it, reducing it to coordinates and classifications. But the dead zone was never empty. It was full of purpose, full of memory, full of a love so stubborn and so patient that it had outlasted the bodies that first felt it, and the world that first inspired it, and the very concept of time that should have erased it. I closed my eyes and listened to the hum of the station and the silence of the stars, and I let the last entry on my chart stand as written. Still here, still watching, still human.